Baroness Kennedy is the shores is one of the most established lawyers, a bench at Gray's Inn and a member of the House of Lords. As well as that, she's a broadcaster, journalist and lecturer. Helena has not only acted in many of the most prominent cases of the last decade, but has promoted civil liberties and human rights far and wide. As director of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, Baroness Kennedy has worked to uphold the independence of the legal profession and respond to some of the most abhorrent acts committed by mankind. Baroness Kennedy, Helena, hello. Thank you for interviewing with Jurist.
It's very, very nice to join you.
So you've recently raised the authoritarian attacks by the UK government on lawyers and the independence of the legal profession, which needs to be upheld, comparing such attacks to tactics used by authoritarian regimes, something which I know you spent many years working on. I recently interviewed a former Lord Chancellor on this. How important is the independence of the legal profession, both here and around the world?
Well, it's one of those things, James, that I feel sometimes gets lost. When we talk about the rule of law, we always link it to, first of all, that we're all equal before the courts, and that it shouldn't just be justice for the powerful, and it should be justice for everyone, and it should be the same. That's one of the fundamentals of the rule of law. But one of the other fundamentals is that there should be an independent judiciary, and people tend to know that one. But what they don't tend to ever refer to is that there also has to be an independent legal profession, that lawyers have to be recognized as being fundamental to the good workings of the courts. People need to be represented because they often don't know, for example, what constitutes good evidence and what burdens of proof there might be and so forth. And so as lawyers, we bring a special set of skills and expertise to the proceedings, but we also bring a high standard of ethics. At least that has been our belief. And for example, we really have to emphasize to the public that lawyers act on behalf of their clients, not just to make sure that their clients get a fair hearing, but also to protect the system. And over the years, I've watched this from my own experience, the ways in which the media, but also politicians, and also the general public seem to think that a lawyer who's acting for example, someone charged with terrorism must sympathize with the cause. That a lawyer acting for immigration cases is somehow trying to open the doors to everybody and is politically driven. And the reality is that lawyers should not be associated with the belief systems of their clients. What we want is that people are well represented, because that makes the system good and true for all of us. And I've done many cases acting for people who have been strongly ideological in ways that with views that I don't share. I mean, I've acted for fundamentalist Islamists who are absolutely against, for example, the equality for women. They don't believe that women should be, for example, judges, or should be taking part in public life, and they feel that women should be basically homebound and chaste. And it's never stopped me acting for them, although I have a very strong set of very egalitarian principles when it comes to feminism and so on. So people shouldn't be associated with the views of their clients. But the press do it all the time. And we've recently had the business, which really was quite outrageous, of politicians talking about lefty lawyers representing people who are asylum seekers, as though somehow your politics came into it. People represent people who have proper cases, and their role is to ensure that there is due process according to law. And so, it's infuriating when people who should know better, sometimes lawyers themselves, our Home Secretary is a lawyer, and yet she finds herself saying things about lawyers that I think is deeply inappropriate and improper for someone who believes in the rule of law. And so it's very easy when governments are being populist and seeking popular support on issues, it's very easy for them to fall into that trap of undermining some of the things that are fundamental to the good workings of democracy. And what you and I know is that, and what all good lawyers know, is that the law is a fabric. And it doesn't matter whether you're a commercial lawyer or an immigration lawyer or a criminal lawyer, whatever kind of lawyer you are, we know, or we should know, that it's all of a piece. And once you start destroying parts of the legal system and thinking that some people don't deserve representation or due process, then you're really undermining the whole fabric. We should be proud in the United Kingdom that we have the respect of the world when it comes to the law, and that's partly because we have great judges who are not corrupt. I mean, when was the last time you ever heard of a judge being in any way connected to disreputable, corrupt behaviour, taking money to affect the outcome of a case? I mean, it just doesn't happen in Britain. And similarly, it's quite rare actually for lawyers to be involved in that kind of behaviour. Not unheard of, but and of course, once you start taking a side to legal aid, where people are not paid properly and don't feel that their professionalism is being respected, the temptations then for people to take additional monies from clients, in addition to legal aid, to make their services available, can become high. That's how you sow the seeds of corruption. And so one of the things that we learned, we had our own period of corruption back in the 18th and early 18th century, but late 17th century. Let's say 18th century, early 19th century. There was corruption amongst our judiciary. But the way that we resolved that was that you gave status to the judiciary. Often when at the highest level, they were made members of the House of Lords. They were given the title of Lord. They were made knights when they sat on the High Court or the Court of Appeal. And so they had the honour of bearing a title. They also were given basically security of tenure, but only if they were found to be corrupt would they be dismissed from the courts, but we wouldn't start second guessing their attitudes or their belief systems. And that independence came from giving those sorts of protections to judges. And what we expected in return was independent, committed service to the law and to justice. And I'm afraid we're likely to lose that respect around the world if we don't take care of it. And that means protecting lawyers and judges. Also, we need to nurture lawyers to become those judges, those independent, ethical, non-corrupt judges. And you don't do that by abusing them and speaking of them in derogatory terms. But listen, one of the things that brings it home to me most strongly is my work internationally. Because now, I've been involved with the International Bar Association before I became the director of the Institute. But one of the things that we know as we do work in different places, protecting lawyers and protecting judges who are at risk, we know that what happens is that authoritarian populist governments, go after the courts, they go after judges, they go after lawyers, because they want to take them under their own control. And so you see the judiciary being captured in places where the judiciary become too frightened to ever find against the state. And that they almost become rubber stamps in doing the bidding of the state. You see the fear that is inculcated in the legal profession. I mean, I've been involved in cases where I couldn't get a firm of lawyers in countries to take on cases against corrupt leading figures in the politics of that country, or I mean, even when it's come to sexual violation of women, not being able to find lawyers who were prepared to take the cases in country because they were fearful of the consequences of taking on those in power. So we really have to recognize that if you start attacking lawyers for the work that they're doing properly and ethically for their clients, then we're in trouble. And it's that generalization. Of course, you're going to, from time to time, find that there are bent lawyers. You know, I mean, we can't pretend that that doesn't happen. And they should be properly brought before their professional bodies, if necessary, and in the right circumstances, they should be prosecuted. But you don't generalize and make whole categories of lawyers sound as if they're corrupt or you know, doing work that is not in the national interest. That's appalling, and that was why I called it out recently. And I have the great privilege of being the president of the Council of Justice. Justice is a fantastic organisation of lawyers across the United Kingdom, and it really does do sort of very interesting work on, you know, how do you, if you're going to think of reforming sections of our legal system, doing the preparatory work and the research to make it available to the senior judiciary, to make it available to government, for them to consider a sensible reform that is not going to interfere with the fundamental principles that pin down the rule of law. And so we have always, justice has always done that work. When certain issues of great import to the nation have come before the Supreme Court, the higher courts in the land, we often provide what's called amicus curiae briefs, supportive briefs to on the arguments of what the legal position is as we see it. And we have those things written by really fantastic legal brains and serious intellectuals in the field of law. So we do this work. Justice is a great organisation. It's not the least bit political. It's got lawyers from across the political space. I mean, except for lunatics, you know, who might not want to be involved in it. You know, I mean, when I say lunatics, I'm talking about, you know, I mean, if you're an anarchist who doesn't believe in law, maybe you wouldn't belong to justice. If you are on the far right and an extreme libertarian, you might not want to be involved in law reform, but because you don't think that the, you know, law should be impinging on your freedoms, but in sensible, you know, lawyers across the political piece support justice, and they are concerned about what's happening in our country just now. You can't. How can I speak out about China and call out China for its breach of international law in that it signed a treaty, the Sino-British treaty, when the UK left Hong Kong, but it made a commitment that it was going to be one nation, two systems, and it was going to respect democracy and the rule of law and the way of doing things that Hong Kong had developed. And it's become very clear that they're not wanting to do that. They started by wanting to have extradition proceedings so that they could have people that they wanted to dealt with in their courts extradited to China.
Absolutely, that was something which I was going to come on to, which is
how can I call out China's interference in the system of law and the system of democracy in Hong Kong if we ourselves are being dismissive of treaties that we've signed? We signed the Brexit treaty. We signed a treaty with the European Union, which was that we were departing, but on a certain basis. And then the next minute is that we want to tear it up. We can't do that. International treaties have meaning, and they're lodged with the United Nations. I mean, it was shocking to watch that going on. And then you're seeing that happening with the Refugee Convention. You know, there's an argument to make. I tend not to agree with it, but I mean, there's an argument to be made about whether the Refugee Convention is fit for purpose in the 21st century. Now, I think the underlying principles of that people being persecuted should be able to flee to a new place and to be given the sanctuary. But it may be that what we're seeing in relation to climate change, people fleeing the torrents of and the torments of fire and brimstone and flood to want to get to a safe place. And it may be that the world has to think again. but in seeking to think about that, there are big issues about what our responsibilities might be in that, and there are legal responsibilities that there might be too. But it's the solution is not to sort of tear up a commitment to provide a haven for those who are being persecuted. And so I just feel that our willingness to tear these things up follows in the footsteps of Trump and follows in the footsteps of Viktor Orban in Hungary, and indeed, of even worse folk like Putin in Russia, or Lukashenko in Belarus, who have no interest in the rule of law.
This is absolutely what my next point was going to be. It's this: the JURIST has been reporting the rule of law in crisis, and obviously more and more at the moment we see that sort of dust thrown up into the air, where there is crisis popping up left, right, and centre across the world, from Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and this culture of impunity for states to commit atrocity and commit human rights violations on the territory of other states wherever they feel necessary, with this total lack of regard for international norms and the rules-based order. How do you see, in terms of those current threats which we see to this rules-based order and the rule of law internationally, where do you see that heading?
Well, first of all, we've got to say, where do I see it coming from? And where I see it coming from is that globalization was something that we largely were greeting as a very positive thing in our world. And we thought it would involve helping poorer parts of the world to come out from under, to have their own development strategies, and to be assisted by the rich world in that development. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. Well, we've seen how reckless greed led to an economic crisis in 2008, which affected the whole of the world. And so the triumph that came after the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed and so on, and we saw a burgeoning of democracies, was a great moment. I mean, many of us felt so excited about the fact that, the juntas in Latin America had collapsed. The apartheid had ended in South Africa. I mean, it looked at the end of the 90s, I was feeling very positive about the state of our world. But I think it was premature. And there was a bit of triumphalism about not just the fact that we felt that democracy and the yearnings for people to have the freedoms that come with genuine democracy. What we ended up with were phony democracies in places like Russia. And we also let the market rip. So instead of it being that, there was going to be successful global markets, and that markets would be developed in places where there never had been free markets before, what we got was a sort of, criminal enterprises and people enriching themselves in the most gross and unforgiving ways, at the expense of ordinary people, and the creation of sort of plutocrats and oligarchs and people who swaggered in their richness. And we in the West, took advantage of some of that. Let's not be dismissive. So I think that our world has come through a thing of a sort of immature celebration of money, and money being the most important value. And we're coming to realize that perhaps there was a folly in a lot of that. And the economic model that was adopted around the world has certainly not shared out and distributed some of the riches that have been created by developments like technology. And so for me, you can't talk about law unless you understand geopolitics. And I always say to my team who work with me at the Institute, or to my young colleagues in my chambers, I always say and when I'm speaking to students, I always say, look at the maps, look at who's next door to who, look at what's happening, make sure you're reading widely, and not nonsense on social media, but read from reliable sources the things that are going on in different parts of the world and why. And so I feel that the undermining and the rule of law's position, which is fragile now, is because we have seen a kind of, if you like, a turning against globalization, the rise of nationalisms, and nationalisms, putting up walls and wanting to look after number one, and not realizing that the solutions to so many problems mean collaboration, and that and internationalism is the way of doing many things. But law, people who run authoritarian governments don't like law, especially if the law holds them to account.
Yeah,
and so they don't like their critics in the media. So they close down the media. They don't like the lawyers who represent their opponents, and they assume that those lawyers are sort of up to their eyeballs in colluding and conspiring to bring down the government as well. And so you end up having, and you also get judges who can sometimes, even if they're not obviously captured, and policemen, that are appointed by the president or premier, but even judges who start off independent, it can start feeling the chill winds of what's going on in the nation, and start being very compliant, and they be that chilling effect on judiciary, so that the judges don't even know they're doing it, but they don't rock any boats, and they take great care. And they think they're doing it to protect the law, but in fact, in many ways, it's about a self-protection. And one can understand the psychology of that, but I'm afraid it's not good for law.
No, absolutely. I agree. I think the rise in authoritarian structures is huge at the moment. And on that point, I wanted to ask you about. Obviously, the UK has recently determined that the treatment of the Yazidis is indeed a genocide, something which you've worked on relentlessly over the last few years, alongside other lawyers at the IBA, like Evelina Rochab, who I interviewed for JURIST a few weeks back. On that point, could you give us maybe a comment on your work on that, and what this means for the Yazidi people?
Well, I mean, one of the terrible things is that the Yazidi were sort of friendless in that region. Their position was almost like that of the Roma in Eastern Europe, a people, or indeed Jews in the 20s and 30s, where a people suddenly, are being blamed for all manner of things that have nothing to do with them, or they're seen as being lesser, or they are marginalized within societies. And the Yazidi, you see, because they were of a very ancient religion, not one of the monotheistic religions, because they seemed so separate and lived in a very different way, they were faced the hostility of Syria, Turkey, Iraq, probably Iran. I don't know enough about what the attitudes in Iran are to the Yazidi, but they were a people a bit like the Kurds. They were basically a people who were held separate, and so when the ISIL, the Islamic State folk arrived on the scene in that region, and were determined to set up an Islamic State going back to an ancient form of the Caliphate, and were deriding democracy and certainly deriding the rule of law as we know it. The Yazidi were in their way, and became an easy target for them, and so that they decided to annihilate them. And they were looking for space, of course, in which to create their caliphate. And so the beheading and slaughtering of the men and boys, the enslavement of the women and girls, and the sexual abuse and treating of people as less than human was just a terrible, terrible thing to document. I went out and spent time with the Yazidi, particularly Yazidi women, in the camps up near Erbil and the Sinjar region, and I met with many of those women who'd been impregnated and had babies and loved those babies because they were so alone and separate, and then had to abandon those babies in camps because their own people didn't want to have the children of the people who had slaughtered so many of them. So, you create a monster in here. And so it was a genocide. I mean, it was undoubtedly about extermination. And the ghastly thing is that we see that in so many places, about wanting to really destroy the humanity of a people. I mean, you see it. I did a report very recently on the Hazara in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, the Hazara are a minority religion. I mean, they're a sort of form of Shia, but they're certainly not part of the dominant form of Islam in Afghanistan or Pakistan. And they are absolutely marginalized, but worse than marginalized. They really are the receiving end of the most terrible persecution. And so of course, when we left Afghanistan and NATO troops pulled out, in the United States and the UK and so on, pulled out of Afghanistan, the Hazara were not high on the list of people who needed to be saved. And yet they are at the front line of the slaughter. And I became involved, as you know, in relation to the women judges and lawyers and so forth. But and some of them were Hazara. But what's happening to the Hazara people continues to be really horrifying. And then you have the Uyghur in China,
exactly.
The Rohingya and so many of them, and they do a signal of what is genocide is what is done to women. The business of impregnating women so that they are producing children that are not going to be seen as being of their community. The orchestrated sterilization or abortion or abortions forced on women. The sexual abuse and violation of women so that they become filled with shame and mortification. I mean, it's just horrible, and that is always a signal of armies or dominant forces that are in the process of creating a genocide. And when we signed the Genocide Convention, we were committing to preventing genocide, not waiting till it's happened. When we see signals of it happening, our duty is to act, and to act to prevent.
Absolutely, that was going to be my last question. Was going to come on to your work on Afghan judges, the women judges, with the IBA, and also yesterday was Hazara Genocide Memorial Day, which commemorates the atrocities committed against the Hazara under the reign of Abdur Rahman Khan in the 1800s, and again we see that continuing today under the Taliban. I was going to ask this. You've sort of already answered it, but how pressing is it to sort of keep eyes on Afghanistan and indeed start to help prevent the genocide of the Hazaras? We see the sort of early warning signs as something which we talk about often, and we never seem to get to the point where we act on early warning and prevent the possibility of genocide. So how pressing is it to recognise the genocide of the Hazaras?
Listen, one of the questions that I'm constantly asked is, do we talk to China? Do we talk to the Saudi Arabians? Do we talk to the Taliban? Now, my answer to that is, of course, you keep doors open because we're never going to get anywhere unless we actually try to change minds. I mean, I'm a firm believer in the hearts and minds business of trying to get people to see why our shared humanity and protecting our shared humanity has to be one of the ground rules in if we want to create a peaceful world. But I don't see that as my job. My job is to call out the horrors and to tell people the stories of what is happening as a human rights lawyer, and to seek to get justice for the people who have suffered. And so when, with regard to what's happening in Afghanistan just now, I mean, I happen to see and believe, and I'm totally convinced that the right word to use is apartheid. Apartheid was about keeping people apart, treating people as second-class citizens, not respecting their humanity and denying people by virtue of some identifying factor the color of their skin, their sex or gender, or their sexuality. Denying people participation in society, the sort of participation which means this is my home, this is the place in which I live, this is my nation, and not to allow them participation, and not allow them the freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom to work, freedom to be educated. All of that's being denied the women and minority peoples in Afghanistan by the Taliban. And so in conversations with the Taliban, those have to be constantly at the forefront. I mean, it's so bad in Afghanistan that we should be doing as we did with South Africa. We should be building a coalition of people that are going to boycott the Taliban and make it clear to them that what they're doing is crime and that they're not going to be supported to develop as a nation until they do something about it. And eventually you get people who get the message. And so, some people say to me, but, you're just going to drive the Taliban into harder positions. No, we cannot. We can do business on many different fronts. But my role in all of this as a lawyer is to talk about justice and to talk about how justice can be secured for people who are being denied justice. And my God, did I see it up close when I was working with the Afghan women who were going to be killed, and indeed 2 senior judges were assassinated, women judges on the Supreme Court. And so we mustn't imagine that the regime is somehow going to be persuaded easily to start respecting the rule of law and human rights. And I have a problem, for example, James, with Saudi Arabia. I was involved in the investigation into the assassination, the extrajudicial killing, because that's what it was, of Jamal Khashoggi. And I heard that man being killed, as if I was in the room with him. It was horrifying, and to hear the recognition by him that he was facing death was horrible. And to know that they then desecrated his body and cut it up, and they had planned it. They brought a pathologist with them. And then the pathologist, before the cutting up, was cross about the fact that it was going to be bad for his back, that he was going to have to do it on the floor.
I recently spoke with Redress and with Matthew Hedges, who was tortured in Saudi Arabia, on his condition and his treatment there. And again, Saudi Arabia is another rogue state with complete impunity for its actions against civilians.
And here we are in a world where the United Kingdom has left the European Union, our nearest neighbours, and so we want trade, and we want trade with China and so forth. Do we pretend that human rights have got nothing to do with this? That what's happening? Are we happy to go into trading relations and not to talk about the fact that there are things going on that we feel, are in fact, do not, I'm not speaking to the best part of the Chinese people. I know lots of Chinese people who are perfectly decent folk. But I mean, what the state does is appalling. And the same thing, we're about to entertain Mohammed bin Salman, roll out the red carpet for him, a state visit. No. I don't mind our ambassadors going and speaking to him and talking to him about the importance of his oil in dealing with this Ukraine-Russian war. We've been, a lot of Europe can't get its oil in the ordinary way from Russia that it did, and so therefore Saudi's being expected to step up. But Saudi's making trillions out of stepping up. They're not doing it as a charitable exercise. Are they playing a proper role in the world? Are they behaving like a decent state? And then you get the long arm of the state going off and killing people. And we've just seen, this happening in so many places. Somebody from my own country, Scotland, a Sikh living and brought up in Scotland,
Yeah.
went out to India in order to marry and to meet his bride. And he was arrested and has been in jail for 6 years on the basis that he used to speak publicly about wanting to see an independent state for Sikhs. You know, rather like folk in Scotland, my home country, talk about independence. But at least they don't get thrown in jail for saying it. And, you know, we have to call out this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Baroness Kennedy, we could speak all day on this. However, I'm going to. What I'll do is I'll.
You have to go. All right,
no,
James.
No,
But
thank you.
yeah.
Thank you so much for interviewing with Jurist. I'll just stop the recording there.
I've got to go because I've got a meeting at
may
Can you see the